Sorry?
I need to be able to hear you. Come and make you up.
We're live streaming.
We're live streaming? Okay.
It's always good to be told when the live stream has started.
Then we don't
I'm going to flop this in here, and hopefully that's not in your way.
No, it won't be.
Thank you, and then I'll get some good audio from it. And it's starting shortly?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got about 2 minutes, I reckon,
Yeah,
of
perfect.
that before they get impatient.
Great, all right.
Yeah, right.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you. Thanks. We've got live streaming on, and clearly for all our people that want to enjoy it, they're waiting online for us. So with your permission, I'll start the morning's proceedings. Before I start, I do an acknowledgement to country. So on behalf of the Community Concussion Research Foundation, I acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to elders both past and present and elders from other communities that may be here today. My name is Andrew Plimpton and I'm chairman of the Concussion Foundation. Perhaps just one moment, many I do know in the room from AFL background. My background is in sport and business. Just a quick profile is I was involved as president of St Kilda Footy Club. I was involved with Australian sailing. I was a long-term member of the Australian Olympic Committee, long-term member of the Australian Institute of Sport and the Australian Sports Commission, and various other roles. So 30 to 40 years involved in active sport, managing 3 Olympic teams for sailing with great success, and also administrating. So I had a good handle on areas such as the AIS, where we had 17 people in sports science. I'm certainly not an expert in the medical field, but from a risk perspective, I've had a lot to do with the issues that are coming up. My business background has been primarily in risk, and part of that risk profile has been for the Australian Olympic Committee of managing risks for them, as I have with the AIS and various other public listed companies. So a background, understand the mechanism and passionate about what we're doing in this particular subject. Peter Jess, I knew from the days when he was a player manager, and many in this room I know have used Mr Jess as they have used you, Ricky, in negotiating. And so it's a long-term relationship I have, and I welcome the other members of this Concussion Summit. I want to record that I am grateful for all the effort and energy that has been put in. This is an amateur group. This is a group that is not taking funds. This is a group that does it on a complete voluntary basis. And whilst we would all hope and anticipate that one day some funding comes through for managing this, all of those in this room from this foundation do it on a basis and are very much thankful and grateful for the personal dedication and the funding that Peter Jess has given us to allow us to gain some emphasis and get this moving on. We have regrettably lost a member of the day, which is one of our medical team, which is Professor Alan Pearce, who I understand has been admitted to hospital this morning. So we wish him well, and we'll have to juggle the agenda around to fit it in. Peter, I think you can cover a number of issues that otherwise Alan was going to talk about. So we have Professor Mark Cook here this afternoon. We also have Brett Geroz, and we may have Dr. Ida Lystad also attending. So on behalf of all the medical team that will be providing this information along with other speakers, I hope it is an informative day, and I thank you all for attending this conference. Today is very much about the history as a starting point and then walking through of what is the future. What can we do in the future? And I will just touch on that in a moment's time. It will be a discussion also in regards with an AFL focus, and whilst we're all recently reading about other sports, in particular national football, rugby league in Sydney, the focus clearly with the expertise and knowledge and those that have been involved with the game of AFL will be the significant focus of today's discussion. And we have good reason. We have good reason to make it because of the number of players, the number of concussion incidents, and also the reaction from the AFL in regards to this subject. Peter acknowledges we invited the AFL to be here today. Regrettably, they're not going to be here. We're going to hear about some personal experiences from those that are suffering, and from my background, those personal experiences are invaluable because you learn not only from the player involved but also from families. When I was president of St Kilda Footy Club for a long time, 4 of those 9 years, the boy Frawley was the captain of the club. I therefore had a great relationship with Spud and understood, as we all do, many in the room that know him, what occurred and how sad an experience it has been, and we can just applaud and thank Anita Frawley for picking up the load, and we can also thank the AFL and St Kilda Footy Club for building that centre down at Moorabbin to assist in welfare matters, to help and assist the matters of concussion. Justin Kosicki was a star player for St Kilda, over 200 games, and he was to be here today. Peter was an apology, I think, with his daughter's birthday, so we would look forward to speaking to Justin or hearing a little bit about his background and some of the matters that he had to face. We'll be speaking also with Peter Venables, who was the father of Daniel, who was an early draft pick and a premiership player at 19 years of age for the West Coast Eagles. And he will be joining us. The issues that he had to face are significant, and the personal experiences and the recollection from his father is interesting. I know many others in the room have got some issues to contemplate and face, and I know sometimes it's not a subject to get up and talk about openly. So I understand and respect that, but I thank all those that have given of their time and energy to assist us in this process. There is a Senate inquiry on at the moment, a federal government Senate inquiry. And this group has made submissions to that inquiry. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the likely outcome? Having been involved with sport for a long time from a federal level, the Australian Institute of Sport, one can only hope that unlike the COVID disease, that we think of this and the issues that surround it a little differently than we thought of COVID, that there is application on a national basis. It's interesting to reflect that in 2021 and 22, the UK House of Commons went through an inquiry on the matter of concussion. Let me just give you a few comments from that inquiry. The inquiry was not at all impressed with how concussion in sport is managed. It was fragmented and ineffective. The committee was astounded sport would be allowed to mark its own homework, conflicts of interest everywhere. And without me highlighting and making too many pointed comments, if we look at the commentary that we're hearing from the major leagues of contact sports in this country, you could apply the same comment perhaps. The government response is that there need to be new guidelines, new protocols, and they would undertake a national register and single guidelines across all sports. That a return to play is a minimum of 21 days. 21 days for all levels of sport. It's not what we're hearing from this country at the moment. And that a concussion passport needed to be developed, and that will be spoken about a little later this morning. If you see of a recent 7:30 report from the unfortunate and regrettable and sad suicide of Heather Anderson, an AFLW premiership player for the Adelaide Crows, you'll see the comments from Dr. Alan Pearce, who was hopefully going to, well, we lost this morning, but also an insight from Professor Anne McKee on CTE and the history and the lack of acknowledgement from the National Football League. So the commonality in regards to hesitancy to address this, there's commonality in major countries in the world to get this matter up and running and properly focused. We saw recent presentations from last Sunday's Herald Sun from Professor Pearce in regards to the statistics of young kids with concussion. 25% of all those admitted presented themselves to emergency departments from the sport of AFL. We have seen a decline in the US and the United Kingdom and Australia in regards to contact sports. We've seen it where in the USA, the National Football League once had 7 million players, it now is down to 3 million registered. Tackle football has changed the rules and regulations, and there's now over 7 million players, and that at junior levels. There is reports that have come out from Oxford University that gives a staggering amount of statistics. So they will be discussed and outlined today. The catch cry for many is, the spectacle is sustainable, save the player, save the game. Hopefully you will all find this morning interesting. I welcome you to participate, and if we have any questions, we'll allow a roving mic to help those on social media, and we will move on with our agenda. So, you will see the websites for Facebook, etc. If you wanted to log on, they're available in front of you, as we can see here.
Hopefully you will all find this.
And we now move on
I welcome
to
you to
introducing
participate. And if we have any
Peter,
questions,
Jess,
we'll allow our
and
roving Mike to help those
John
on
Hennessy
social media.
in regards
And,
to the subject.
We will move on
and
with
I
our
look forward
agenda.
to welcoming
So,
them both to the stage.
you will
Peter,
see,
instead of shaking hands and welcoming everybody,
the
we'd love to see you
websites
up here.
for
And John Hennessy.
Facebook,
So
etc.
I look
If you
forward to
want
welcoming
log on,
you
They're
and your
available
address.
in front of you.
Thank you, Peter.
The welcome to country has been met by the president of this group, and I'm now going to follow suit and make mention of the two groups who didn't turn up today, which was the AFL and the AFLPA. Now, you know, concussion, one would have thought, would be front and centre of their mindset, but not to engage with a group of people that are committed to change, for me, is a stunning indictment of where they really sit. The AFL is a not-for-profit. They don't pay tax. So what we have is a situation, let's say next year they earn $600 million from the broadcast rights and pay no tax. If it was an ordinary company, they would be paying $200 million. So, knowing that they've got this bonus of $200 million, one would have thought the forefront of that should be applied to the key stake people involved in our sport for their safety. Now, I can guarantee you that that's not the case. In fact, up until recently, the only funds that were put in by the AFL came from the fines that they imposed on the players. So the players actually had to pay for their own research. Now, what did that research look like? Well, in the early days, it was led by Professor Paul McCrory, right? And he was the world's leading champion of concussion in terms of return to play protocols and also the rehab of it. Now, subsequent to that, in 2019, I wrote to the AFL and I said to them quite clearly that the medicine and science that is espoused by Professor Paul McCrory is a danger for the players. And here are the reasons. And I listed, the reasons. One is that the clinical outcomes that we saw didn't match his science or medicine. They were telling us that, concussion is transitory. The science and medicine says it's not, and this has been validated by the Oxford University, who published a report in January this year, 2023, where they, over a 25-year period, looked at 15,000 or more people, and they then did a detailed analysis of their traumatic brain problems. So what happened? They found that even one mild concussion can cause problems long-term in terms of the early onset of dementia and the cognitive functioning of the brain. They stated that if you had 3 concussions, you should be counselled about whether you should continue in the sport. Now, that is a very serious position that we find ourselves in because we don't have a concussion passport. So we don't know. So, the AFL sends 396 players out each week without any idea of what the structural and functional state of their brain is. Now, on the AFL's own statistics, up until round 16, we found that there were currently, and this is only because it's only over a 3-year period we've been looking at the stats, we found that there were 18 players who had received, up to date, 3 clinical concussions. One of them had received 5. Now, nowhere have I seen that there is a program, to counsel these players to tell them, well, if you have a fourth, it is worse long-term than the third, and if you have a fifth, it's worse than the fourth. Slowly but surely, you will have the position where you will enter dementia far earlier than somebody that has not had a TBI. Now, so what does that tell us? It tells us that the AFL has abandoned this cohort and its duty of care to inform them of exactly what your state of your brain is. Now, there's a whole range of other longitudinal studies that I've looked at from Sweden that said is that if you have a TBI at the age of 15, you're 6 times more likely to provide an outcome of violence, 6 times more likely to be on social security, and 6 times to die before the national age for males. Now, collateral to that, the cost to the community was around about $1 million for somebody that had over the journey that it would cost the society to manage the health and welfare of somebody in that state. So I've been pleading with the AFL that you cannot have a concussion management system if you do not have a concussion passport, because at any given point in time, you don't know the state of somebody's brain from a structural point of view or a functional point of view. Now, that means is that we have seen where the AFL has seen fit to allow a guy who we know, recently returned, who had 9 clinical concussions and then came back and had a 10th. Tell me, what other employer would allow that to happen? I mean, it is just unbelievably criminal. We have the AFL's mandate is that the health and safety of every player is paramount. Yet, where is that translated into research? And that is, the independent research. So, as I said before, Paul McCrory, who I said was dangerous, was subsequently in 2022 found to have plagiarised papers and manufactured research. Now, if you follow the bouncing ball, you will see in the concussion position paper today, there is at least 27 references of papers prepared by Paul McCrory. Now, I could use a technical term here, and I probably will, because that's me. I would say it's bullshit. We have a concussion position paper that guides every person that plays collision-based sport based on plagiarism and manufactured research. And it sits there in front of us. I wrote to the Minister of Health, and he said, we're looking at it. Good. So he's now the Minister for Mirrors. He keeps looking at it. I mean, it is, my point is this. If we don't get serious about this, what we'll do, we'll create the next generation and the generation after of people who are brain damaged. Now, what we found in the independent research that we studied, it showed that people who had a TBI in collision-based sports such as AFL and rugby had a higher percentage than the rest of community to engage in domestic violence. What are we doing about that? What are we doing about the wives and partners, right? I actually don't know any money that has been spent on providing facilities for the wives and partners, any safe place that they can go to try and help their partners on the way through. Because what we find is this is when you have structural damage, there's 4 lobes of your brain. And our brain mapping over the last 10 years has shown that predominantly people who play a collision-based sport will have damage at the frontal lobe of their brain. Now, the frontal lobe of the brain is the executive decision-making part of the brain, right? That creates all of the outcomes. So what we find over time, if you've got a TBI at that point, which we can find, there are scans that will show us that in each part of the brain, there are 68 functionalities inside the brain, right? And of those, we can track what that function does. I mean, there's a lot of talk about eye tests, which is good, but that's only one part. The eyes control 53% of the brain's function. So we've got to address the other 47% that we're not doing. So you need to have a multimodality system, which we'll get onto later. But, getting back to my theme, because as, the President will tell me, I must stay on message, which is very difficult for me, as you can see, because I'm probably brain damaged, which I am. I mean, I've had two, crashes and they found when they scanned my brain that out of the 68 points of functionality, I had damage to 42. But I engaged in neuroplasticity, which made me have the ability to rewire my brain. So I know that we can do it. You won't ever be 100%, but you can actually have a program that will make sure that you can actually function to a good level. Now, why we need to minimise, concussion is my message. Well, it is quite simply this, is that if we don't have the tools, right, which is a concussion passport, which must be mandated for everybody that participates in a collision-based sport. Doesn't matter what it is. That then gives you the baselines that then we can check and see when you turn up to play, especially in recent times we found the unfortunate situation where a young guy died on the pitch, and it appeared, which we're not sure yet, that it may have been due to him not recovering from a initial concussion. And so what it did is that when he had the second one, and the first one hasn't resolved, it presented as if he had a heart attack. So what happens is that the electrical system in your brain shuts down and you present as if you've had a heart attack. But we actually didn't do, well, we are now because, thankfully, the mother of the guy has sent his brain off to the Sports Brain Bank to be looked at to see if, in fact, he had some, previous trauma that could have been stopped. But if we had have had a, if we had have had a concussion passport, we would have been able to monitor that, and then we would have been able to say, well, look, sorry, you've had X number, and you should not be allowed to play. And what I know that sounds tough, but what we need to do is to ensure that we change the whole nature, to make it safe. And that means we've got to limit, collisions of training. We should, in fact, in the US, there is no, collision-based training. That's finished. And we should be following suit. And also, we should be limiting, the number of games, because what we found is that in all of the research that we've looked at, it's not necessarily the number of concussions that you have, but it's the number of times that you have hits, and it is the length of time that you're in the game. Because what we found is that you can have a subclinical concussion, but that still creates microscopic brain trauma. And that then builds up to a point in time when, unfortunately, you start to have permanent post-concussion syndrome. In life, we now know that we can look at the types of behaviour problems that are part of CTE, and it's now been drilled down to TES, which is traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. And so that means while you're still alive, it is telling you that there are presentations that you are more likely to have some long-term problems with CTE. But as we've found with some of the people who have had their brains tested post-mortem, 50% of them didn't present with CTE, but they presented with CNI, which is chronic neuropathological impairments. So that means that the brain was damaged, but it hadn't been to the next stage where the tau protein had developed. So whilst CTE is front and centre, it's not the only thing we need to look at in terms of the broad spectrum of what are the problems that we have with repetitive head knocks. Because quite simply, it's the collisions and the transfer of the energy that create the problems. So what we need to do is focus on prevention and mitigation. And in the recent Welsh rugby study, they found a number of things that had been used as mitigators for the damage. One was the first thing you do is strengthen your neck, because what we've found is that when you have a collision, you get a whiplash effect. So the more strength you have in your neck, the more that you can actually slow down the impact of that. The second one was to take longer to come back from a concussion. So the 12 days is not based on science. When I looked at how they developed that 12 days, because originally it was 6, but after I went to the AFL and said, well, here's all of the evidence, it's saying at least you stop playing for 21 days and then you come back on the 28th for males and possibly longer for women. So then they produced this 12-day return to play protocol. Nowhere in the science, nowhere in the medicine can I find that there has been clinical studies to support that that's safe. So this was developed, in my view, best described as a Nigerian witch doctor with a burnt chicken leg walking past and waving it at you to determine whether, in fact, you are better. I mean, it's complete and utter scientific and medical nonsense. There's a wide range of biomarkers that actually tell us whether your brain has resolved back to normal. So we can actually take a blood sample post a game and we can tell you whether there is these particular molecules present in your brain, which is saying that you haven't healed. The two that are currently being used are neurofilament light and lymphocytic acid. Both of them are present in trauma. Now, I went to the AFL in 2011 and said, well, this is the research that we're finding. These are the researchers that I'm working with who think that they can find, the antidote that would mitigate an acute outcome to a mild, but you'll need to research these, biomarkers. Unfortunately, when I presented this material to them, I got what is commonly called now the Logan Roy, which anybody that's watched Succession would know it's a fairly curt term. So, which really didn't faze me. So I'm still working in this genre. Now what we're discovering, right, that there is a particular problem that is a silent killer in our sport. And this is where you have low-level, chronic levels of inflammation. Now, what our research shows us is that that's a precursor to problems with heart attacks, problems with the early onset of motor neuron disease. All these things are able to be tested for using, biomarkers, but we don't. We simply leave it till somebody walks his dog and has a heart attack and we say, oh, what a poor bugger. You know, like he's out walking his dog. Not really saying, well, okay, if he's played a collision-based sport, his body would be in a perpetual state of trying to fight off all of the different types of problems that he's got, which creates this, problem. We need to focus more on prevention and mitigation. The fact that the AFL wants to go and spend money on studies of the longitudinal type, for me, is a complete waste of time and waste of money. We need to focus now on how do we prevent and how do we mitigate. There's enough studies throughout the world that have confirmed that there is a problem, and the fact that we want to say, well, because we're in the AFL, somehow we're different to soccer, somehow we're different to rugby, somehow we're different to the NFL. It's simply not right. The brain, when it gets whacked, doesn't know whether it's in the US, the UK, or whatever. It just gets whacked. And this is the thing: is that we've got to start to realise that the science and medicine is telling us this. I see it almost on a daily basis of guys who were fit, fine young men when I first started to work with them. Now in their early 60s and early and late 50s. There's a number of them. You spin them 3 times round in the room and ask them, where's the door? Struggle. And that's no reflection, it's just the fact is that, that they struggle with a whole range of things. And we need to address that. And one of those is to have a proper compensation fund, knowing full well that these guys have been hurt. There's no workers' compensation, so we've got to find the right ways. Now, I've run over time. I'll now pass on to my colleague, Johnny Boy.
You've just heard some references to the Senate inquiry, and the Community Concussion Research Foundation made a submission to the inquiry. It's about 100 submissions that were made. I'm just going to quickly summarise the Foundation's submission, and when you read through the 100 submissions, it's remarkable how much commonality there is between the various sort of scientific, medical, community sporting bodies who made submissions. It's very strong themes running through what the Senate inquiry heard, and it'll be fascinating to see in 3 weeks' time what the Australian government is going to do about the submissions when they're tabled in Parliament. Okay, so just a bit of context. Australia's been a world leader in public health policy for many decades. Seatbelts, tobacco, vaccinations, cancer screening, etc. I'll apologise for these slides, probably some of the worst slides you'll ever see in your life, but just get through the information. These public health policies are contributing to increased longevity, such that 50% of people born after 1971 will live to be 100 years of age. One key public health area where Australia is lagging the world by the observations of a number of people is brain injury in sport. Sport obviously has many societal benefits, and Australia is a sport-obsessed country, but the AFL and rugby are probably 2 of the standout problems in global sport in terms of the concussion and CTE sort of incidents incurred in those sports. And the problem in Australian football in particular is that concussions and CTE is increasing quite rapidly, especially at junior level. And the converse of that is that participation in AFL is actually in decline. Parents are now running scared, and I think that is not putting it too lightly. In 1990, Australian football in Australia had more players than soccer. In 2020, soccer had twice as many players as AFL. Basketball had 30% more on government figures, not on the figures of the peak sporting bodies, which in most cases are complete rubbish. There's no doubt that lives, as you've heard from Peter, that lives are being destroyed. And the question is, with all the money in football, why are the players being left behind? That's the question that's never been asked. Self-regulation, the conclusion that you'd have to come to is that self-regulation of concussion by sport has failed dismally, mainly due to a conflict of interest. And currently no organisation in Australia is available to effectively regulate safety in sport. The system is really is set up to fail. As Peter has explained, no one really knows the extent of the problem. Players may be feeling okay after some hits, but they're not. And hospitalisations radically underestimate the incidence of concussion in the community. The number of unreported concussions in sport, according to a number of scientific bodies in Australia, may be as many as 10 times the number disclosed to team doctors annually. A survey in Canada at a major Canadian hospital found nearly 90% of concussed patients had not even recognised their injury, and that's a common feedback around the world. Most GPs have limited knowledge of brain injury and are not really able in many cases to add much to the situation. As Peter said, the testing is really back in the sort of bow and arrow days, especially in Australian football, and in many cases there is no testing, so you cannot gain a good line on what's actually happening. And in a sport where every single thing is measured to the nth degree, you know, not the number of yards you gain for your team, the number of this, the number of that, blah, 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 on and on and on. The only thing not mentioned is the condition of the players' brains. And that's probably the most important thing just on the field. It's being damaged, and there's absolutely no measurement for 99% of the players' brains on a sort of week-by-week basis. The alarm bells are ringing, as we've heard. Politicians are now becoming involved. Just all parties in the Australian Parliament have supported the Senate inquiry. It reports to Parliament, as I said, in 3 weeks. You've heard from the President here, just Andrew, about the situation in the UK, where they've now started to act on a concussion passport, and the Football Association in the UK has announced that it would start a trial to remove heading in soccer. In America, they've got return to play legislation in every state. As you've heard, tackle football numbers are declining rapidly in America. They've halved in the last 15, 20 years, and almost no NFL players have actually have left the sport without some signs of CTE. In Canada, there's a parliamentary subcommittee that's been formed a couple of years ago that has called for major change and a coordinated national research program. A study of 235,000 people in Canada found that the long-term risk of suicide increases threefold amongst adults who have had concussions. In just looking at the big picture, there's no doubt that world sport now, as we keep on hearing, is being reshaped by private equity investment. It's all about the digital spectacle, what people would like to watch. There's no doubt that, as we've all been saying for 20 or 30, 40 years, that AFL is a great game. Some people say it's the best game in the world, but it does endanger player health and safety. So if we wish to save the game, which is the reason we're here today, how can we come up with some measures? What package of measures will enable us to sustain the game into the future and ensure that it's going to be here in 2100? Because if we sit back and do nothing, which is what's happening now basically, there's no doubt that the game is endangered. So the AFL future scenarios, will they stay in Australia? Will they start going overseas into New Zealand, USA and China? You know, that's the question that's being discussed around board tables in some places in the last few years. The problem being that the major potential for disruption, that concussion is in fact a major threat to the future of the sport, and the number of parents who will be increasingly looking at the media replies of content about concussion and CTE in Australian football and rugby in particular will be the court of public opinion which will decide these issues. As we've heard, Australia lags the rest of the world in managing concussion, according to Dr. Chris Nowinski. In Australia, we're still having this debate about the link between concussion and sport. Contact sport athletes, according to recent studies, are 68 times more likely to develop CTE than the general population. Concussion and CTE are preventable diseases. What are we doing to minimise them? Not a great deal at the moment, because the rate of concussion is actually increasing. CTE, as you've heard from Peter, does actually correlate well with more years that the sport is played. The guiding principle we keep on hearing about is, if in doubt, you sit it out. If you don't test on a weekly basis for all players, then there's doubt, but the players don't actually sit it out. and that's the conundrum we face here with AFL and with rugby. Australian football and rugby have some of the highest concussion rates in team sports in the world, 5 to 10 times higher than soccer, basketball, cricket, netball. And if you look at the fact that there's 1.5 million players roughly on the government figures playing AFL and rugby currently, in 10 or 15 years' time there'll be a second 1.5 million players coming through the system playing. In 10 or 15 times there'll be, say, a third 1.5 million players. So you can see the potential for early onset dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, motor neurone, and the cost to the Australian community is going to be absolutely massive unless we can get a handle on how to start to achieve a decline in the concussion and CTE in collision sport. In a survey that came out last week from the Players Association, 92% of AFL players are concerned about the potential long-term effects of concussion, and well they should be. We also note that the increased susceptibility of women to subconcussive outcomes, and again, they're playing with absolutely no change in the rules to the males, despite the fact that there's increasing evidence that they're more susceptible and take significantly longer to recover. As you've heard from the President, in the UFA, tackle football numbers are collapsing, especially in colleges. Tackle football has 23 times the number of high severity head impacts compared to flag football. Today's parent will be, a comment that was in the paper last week, will be swiftly unforgiving of any sport as soon as he or she suspects it's playing chicken with their children's brain. And also Nathan Gibbs, a former team doctor with the Sydney Swans for 14 years, said the real rate of concussion inside clubs is about 2.5 times higher than the AFL's published figures, which would make it comparable to the NFL's in America. I think there's a lot of pressure not to report concussions, he said. So the concussion crisis is that the AFL and other football codes have used uncertainty about the CTE to justify a wait and see approach rather than being proactive and trying to actually put in place measures and rules and preventative actions to achieve a reduction in concussion. In the USA, just NFL players between 30 and 49 had dementia-related diagnosis to 19 times the national average. This just goes on and on and on and on. There's now dozens and dozens and hundreds of studies around the world saying, which are all saying the same thing. This is a dangerous situation, but nothing is being done about it. So with the AFL, their income last year, $944 million, as Peter said, no tax was paid. The AFLPA, their income last year was $85 million. The TV rights has increased massively from $156 million in 2011 to $642 million in 2025. The AFL priority, without a doubt, as has been said by a number of people inside the system in the last 12 months, is to protect the brand, protect the spectacle, maximise the dollars. The expenditure by the AFL and the Players Association on 5,000 past players who are registered with the Players Association and whom on their own announcements, over half of them have long-term injuries, is about $1 million per annum is going out from the system into the players' pockets, and that's covering training, medical, hospital, the whole box and dice, $1 million. Total AFL income, $944 million. Now, you can't tell me that their priority is player health and safety. It is not. Concussion is bad for business in the AFL. That's how it's seen. It's seen as a threat. Care is seriously lacking. As we said before, with all the money in football, why have the players been left behind? We all look at football each week and look at the games and the diagnosis and the comments, but we don't see what's happening behind the scenes. You know, what's happening with what we're seeing is a massive human tragedy which has a very long tail. Self-regulation has not worked, and the AFL is really accountable to no one. That's the AFL concussion structure from 2021. There's about 100 people involved in that structure. A whole lot of steering groups, medicos, scientific people, advisors, PR people, the whole works. We've got 100 people, and despite all that effort, concussion is actually increasing. And so, why does the AFL? What's the evidence that the AFL has a lack of care for players? Concussions are increasing. There's no systematic testing. Current sanctions for dangerous play are not changing player behaviour. There are no match-safe rules for juniors. So Brenton Sanderson said last month that he's coaching under-8s at school, and in 1 hour, 4 or 5 players had substantial knocks to their heads and were taken off the field. Now, that's under 8-year-olds. So there's no match-safe rules for juniors. There's no safe protocols for juniors and females. There's a minimal care for retired players. Sort of beat the drum continuously, but nothing changes. No workers' compensation, income protection. The AFL mental health and wellbeing strategy does not include retired players, which is absolutely amazing. And it has a shameful history of concussion management and research. It's paying lip service to care for players. Its main focus is trying to maximise the $944 million. This year it'll be going past $1 billion, and in a couple of years' time it'll be much above that. So fantasy football, 4 recent quotes from AFL Leaders. Which of these are spin and which are true? The health and safety of players is the AFL's key priority, and we take concussion extremely seriously. The AFL is committed to world-leading management of head trauma in sport. We have a conservative approach, guided by research, putting players' health first. And the 2 true statements, the most important thing is that people are watching AFL, and we will continue to use the consensus statement, which is, crap, to inform further work into concussion management. So who's paying the price? It's not the AFL paying the price. It's the players, their families, and the Australian community and government is paying the price for this massive neglect of player health and safety. The juniors, just a sort of total disaster situation there. Most concussions in teenage years happen playing sport. The more you tackle or hit, the more likely you are to suffer permanent brain damage. It's not the number of it's not the level of the sport that was played, but how often it was played. It's not how hard people are being hit, but how often. We keep hearing these things. And Queen Wood, just an all-girls school in Sydney, has now banned students from playing AFL because of concern for their brains. And as Chris Nowinski said, there is absolutely no reason for children to play adult forms of the sport. Suicide is the leading cause of death among young Australians. More than 350 young people aged 18 to 24 take their lives every year. For every youth suicide, there's 100 to 200 more attempts, and the risk of attempted suicide is 3 to 4 times higher in patients with severe TBI compared to the general population. And we've all heard this quote from Professor Romelu in America: letting kids play football is akin to child abuse, the definition of which is the intentional exposure of a child to the risk of injury. You wouldn't let your child drink a glass of cognac or smoke a cigarette, so why would you send him out on the football field to risk brain damage? So the better future, just to wrap this up, the better future, and you'll have these on your tables because this is what we'd like you to discuss after lunch and come back with your thoughts. If we are trying to reduce concussion by 25% per annum, which is the position of the Community Concussion Research Foundation, we're going to have to take some action that's not happening currently, and also we are privileged to have the 2032 Brisbane Olympics, and we're hoping by then that something has changed so that Australia could be taking a leadership position in world sport in relation to concussion and CTE prevention and mitigation. Okay, so the better future, here's a 10-point plan as to how to achieve it. The federal government, hopefully, just as a result of this Senate inquiry, will appoint a National Sports Health and Safety Commission, which will come up with consistent protocols and policies for all sports in Australia. Hopefully, rules for juniors will change so that non-contact version become the standard. So similar now to AFL 9s. As Professor Mark Cook says, we need to stop children banging their heads. And in females, we need to take account of the fact that they do have increased susceptibility and recovery times, so an abundance of caution is needed, which is not happening now. We need a best practice concussion management system, which you'll be hearing about, which you've heard something about from Peter Jess already, and possibly more shortly. We need tougher sanctions that change coach and player behaviour, including the sin bin. We've had people like Scott Pendlebury, John Longmire calling for the sin bin. Of course, you know, the past history would be that people say, oh no, that's no good, it'll destroy the game, blah, 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 blah. But if the coach and players had much tougher sanctions, including the sin bin, you can guarantee it's going to change the way the game's played, and the reckless attack on players' heads would become a much more scarce occurrence. We need legislation for workplace injury and compensation, as Peter has called for. We need retired player care that actually delivers for those suffering in silence. It's time to walk the talk, and Ken Hunter will be here after lunch, hopefully, to talk about the fifth quarter and the need to have a model such as is in place now in the NFL Player Care Foundation, with independent care for retired players actually happening rather than not happening as in Australia. We need neurovisual training and neck strength measurement for all players, and the standard there would be F1 standard, the Formula One in motorsport, where they spend a large amount of time strengthening their necks, because for every 1% improvement in neck strength, you reduce the chance of concussion by 3%. We need a national concussion CTE awareness and education plan. We need to improve TBI recognition by GPs, and we're talking to the College of General Practitioners about that, and we need further research funded but not managed by the AFL. Their history in research has been absolutely terrifying. So if in fact we can come up with a spectacle that is sustainable, that's the object of this exercise. What changes do we have to make to the status quo where concussion's increasing? What changes do we have to make so the concussion is reducing by 25% per annum? And by 2032, Australia, is in a leadership position. There's 10. We're putting those 10 steps on the table. You'll get copies of that just over lunch, and then after lunch at your table, having discussions about which other things you would like to comment about those 10 steps, or you think there's other things that should be added. So to save the game, we need to save the players, and we need to make sure that the spectacle is sustainable. So let's be on the right side of history and start to move forward to start to reduce concussion in contact sport in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you both Peter and John for your presentation. There was a lot said, and we thank you for all the research and all the hard work and analysis that you have done. Perhaps if I could ask, before we go on to the next subject, if on the presentations that have been made, if there's any questions from you in the audience. There is a roving microphone if we need it for the video display. So if anyone's got any questions, any queries, any points that you would like to clarify, let's spend a couple of minutes if that's required. What I didn't do was to give background on introduction to John Hennessy. So despite Peter's strident criticism of the AFL, well deserved, Peter, was that John was a former corporate planner, establishing the AFL nationally. In the 1980s, he was also strategic planning manager for Toyota Australia for 10 years and CEO of International Best Practice Research for 20 years. So a significant background in business and sport, and importantly employed by the AFL. So this is just not trite, smart-ass comments. This is very much the views and analysis from somebody inside the system. So is there any questions that we have of Peter or John for the moment before we move to our next speaker? Ricky.
The AFL or AFLPA provide any excuse or explanation as to why they're not here today?
The AFL didn't want to share a forum. The AFL chose not to share a forum with us because they said that our views are diametrically opposed to theirs. The same with the AFLPA. So I'm not sure how they decided that was the case, but quite clearly we're driven by trying to make the game safe. We actually think that if you look at the game in itself is a inert thing. What is the game is the people that make up the game. So if we're not prepared to look after the people who actually create and make the game, how then can we have a social conscience about saying, that the basis of playing sport is to improve your health and fitness, but ignore the long-term trauma that happens when you are neurologically damaged? It doesn't make any sense. Is it? Okay. Thanks, Rick. Any other questions?
There's none.
Yes.
Just a question. The largest proportion of football players play in community competitions.
Yes.
If you make any comments whether the statements you're making, there's any differential that you'd point out?
No. Okay, so when we first did our research with Dr. Alan Pearce to measure the long-term damage from playing football season on season, we used both elite and sub-elite. So we went back to a junior football club and measured the damage that was happening to these guys, and it was exactly the same as at the elite level, and in fact some cases worse. So it compels us to get better at the grassroots. I mean, there's this mantra that 12 days is safe. It's simply not. It cannot be. In science and medicine, it is unproven that it is safe at 12 days. What we need to do is really take stock and start to evolve, as John said, systems of safety that have a national standard that are based on science and medicine. 12 days is not.
Sorry. And also just to note that that Monash University has conducted over the last 3 or 4 years quite comprehensive studies of amateur players and community players, and found exactly the same situation as we're finding with the AFL players. Yeah.
Pete, you said the government was involved. How involved are they?
The government has some of its arms of business sponsors the AFL. So we have different government arms sending money to the AFL to continue what we consider to be an unsafe workplace. The government takes a backward step in terms of monitoring and ensuring that we have world's best practice, which is unfortunate for the participants. But that's what it is, John. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Any others?
It's a bit like the AFLPA. It's fed by the AFL, so they have to be sort of governed by what they say by Big Brother, I suppose.
Unfortunately, the AFLPA are conflicted when it comes to the two separate playing groups. You have the retired players and then you have the current players. The current players, I think on last count, get possibly about greater than 90% of the revenue that's generated, and the past players get less than 10% of that. The playing cohort of the AFL at the moment is just over 1,100 players, and the past player cohort is about 3,000. So on any straight line metric, there is a huge discrepancy between the revenue that is then given to the past players' welfare and support versus what is given to the current players. And that's always going to be the conundrum. But what we find is that current players still don't realise is that, they are the past players of, tomorrow. And they've got to provide and provision for the situations that we're seeing that are in front of us now, which is, there's a significant number of players. I mean, the fact that you have 300 ex-players are compelled to take legal action to get proper justice. I mean, it's frightening. I mean, how can an organisation that is a charity or a not-for-profit, which is supposed to look after its own, not look after these people in terms of wives and families and, you know, support systems of guys that are damaged? I mean, it's frightening. But, you know, you have Gil is the highest paid person in our sport. And last time I looked at the fixture, his name hasn't presented anywhere on any team sheet, but he's still the highest paid person in our game. And that includes, in any worldwide sport that I've looked at, no CEO gets paid higher than the star players. Yet we have Gil, who gets paid more than any superstar that we have in our game. And as I said, I've been looking at the team sheets. I still haven't seen him, but anyway, let's just wait and see. Yes.
Great stats, by the way. Great presentation so far. I've got a few more stats we could probably add to that too, just in the general community. But one question really is around the way that we're moving forward with testing and assessing. What are your thoughts on validation of things like protocol and applied technologies in that space? Because it's a little bit of a fluffy zone. A lot of people coming up with revised ideas of the same old story. But what's your thoughts on that process?
I'm firmly driven by science and medicine. You know, I mean, what we need is where players aren't validated on subjective outcomes. What we need is biomarkers of science so they can't tell fibs. I mean, the fact that, you know, the recent survey of players said that 10% of them didn't report a subclinical concussion tells you that, okay, if it's not reported, not treated, therefore not rehabilitated. And what they don't understand is this: the accumulation of subclinical concussions causes catastrophic brain damage if it's not rehabilitated or treated. I mean, that's the first thing that these guys have, you know, got to realise, is that we have a number of players who we're happy to share their life stories with. And, you know, some of them are just absolutely tragic. I mean, I've got a guy who I'm working with who had 2 clinical concussions reported, yet the left and right frontal lobe of his brain has atrophied, it's died. And there's no medical records.
I think one of the major things that's happening right now, so I work in the space of applied technology and human performance, have done for nearly 15 years. And one of the biggest issues we have is around the disrespect of reliability in applied applications and applied technology. So it's not the technology that's biased, it's the application that's biased. So one thing we're really seeing now are things like oculometer trackers and things which diagnose or at least give you some kind of systematic approach and education at the same time. But we're also seeing a reverse on things just released in the Australian, I think this morning, was as an application that full respect of people coming up with great ideas, but it's still in a better format being released to kids across the communities. So part of the problem we've got here is to make sure that whatever we do use to standardise the foundation of our research has to have some form of validity too. And there's too much brown paper bags floating around with good apps that aren't achieving that. So, you know, in order to get this research to really, really sing, we've got to draw a line in the sand, surely.
Look, what I've always maintained is to get a true gauge of the state of your brain structurally and functionally, you have to undergo a range of multimodality tests. Not one test will give you a full view of the functionality. As we said, is that, you know, the eye tests, the oculomotor tests, the blood biomarkers, all need to be linked with the scans. MEG scans, I think, are really important and not used to the fullest extent. where they measure the delta and gamma waves in your brain that pick up the, thanks, John. He's just confirmed I'm computer illiterate, amongst other things. So, you know, this is the whole thing about science. You know, we've got to be driven by it, you know, because nobody can cheat. And unfortunately, players have got a track, record of not being honest.
So, I mean, to just take this point a little further, I think this is great feedback as well about the conversation here is we are looking at validity and we're looking at science and then making an impact from many different angles. One of the biggest problems we have here, which is evident around all sports, I'm actually a soccer coach for 20 odd years, but the same issues are going around with the sociology is a problem.
Yes.
It's actually not the evidence of the facts people are accepting. We did a few
Yes.
very objective assessments, give you some feedback of a junior league up in the northern suburbs of Victoria, 10,000 participants,
Yeah.
60 concussion events per weekend for the junior league.
Yeah.
We did assessments on 7 AFL athletes. 6 of them had 16 concussion. Sorry, wrong. 6 of them had 21 concussion events in their
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
1 of them had 16. So when you look at this and you stand in front of someone who's
Yeah.
just approaching 40 years of age and on retirement frames,
Yeah.
and you see them suicidal.
Yeah.
These are the facts, they're sociology.
Yeah.
I think it's this is the information we need to get out there.
Yeah.
There's one last bit I think which we also add to that is you mentioned before about the kids, the juniors playing.
Yes.
So we're seeing a lot of doing a lot of validation around research of functional movement and screening in schools, secondary schools. We're seeing the same issue around. You can kind of spot the AFL with
Yeah.
It's with regards to disruption, disruptive in class. Studies
Yeah.
in the UK will show that over 50% of all inmates have had TBIs.
And also the US.
Sociological
Yeah.
issue, exactly. Yeah. So it's a sociological issue that's far outside
Yeah.
the AFL. The AFL needs to take some accountability on
It is.
where the seed is starting. And we know that.
Yeah. I think, the one thing that we've got to look at is this, is that the game is based on violence. Whether we like it or not, it is based on violence. It was first created by 2 groups of men meeting in a park with a ball and basically beating the shit out of each other. And that morphed itself into a game with rules. But the rules are that you can conduct yourself in a way on a field that is totally unacceptable to society. That you can belt somebody, you can run at them at pace, you clobber them, you knock them senseless. If you did that outside of a football field, you'd be arrested, and more than likely, you'd be transitioned into a behavioural modification program, which is called jail. I'm not really sure, that we don't understand is that the AFL has created this parallel system of judiciary. So to avoid the fact that people engage in horrendous acts of violence against each other, and to prevent the police coming onto the Oval, they have their own judicial system, which is called the tribunal. And it makes judgment about the level of violence that has been enacted and grades it, and grades the level of violence. Oh, and the intent. I mean, if you belt the shit out of somebody, you belted the shit out of body. Does that mean that you didn't do it on a premeditated basis? Well, if we have a system that says safety is paramount, you stop before you engage in the next level of violence. You stop. Time and time again, it's so ingrained in our system of being heroic and, deeds of great courage. It's not courage, it's stupidity. Because at the end of the day, when you're 65 and you can't remember the names of your kids, you look back and say, well, I was brave. And everybody, your family and friends are saying, well, sorry, we need to change the tyres on your wheelchair, These are the realities of life,
Challenging for the non-experts with contested views. I'm wondering, does the Australian Medical Association or one of the Australian colleges of neuroscientists or any of these groups, do they have public positions?
Yeah. They published your concussion position paper. Like as I said, and references in there, there's 27 direct references to Paul McCorry. And in there, there's another subset of people who Paul McCorry's trained. I mean, the recent WorkSafe review of return to play protocols by the AFL was conducted by two people. One was a physiotherapist and the other was a biomechanic. None of them, not either one, had training in brain trauma. No brain trauma. So these guys decided, right, that the return to play protocols were safe. And not only did they do that, when I asked WorkSafe to give me the copies of their reports, initially they told me there were 2 reports by these guys. And since 2019, I've been engaged with WorkSafe saying that this is an unsafe workplace and you must prosecute the AFL. You must have accountability for the number of people who have been injured, like every other corporate citizen. So far, I'm in VCAT now. This has gone on since 2019. Probably 4 or 5 times we've had a VCAT hearing. Last time they brought in the chief investigator for WorkSafe to detail what happened with these reports. The chief investigator, on oath, stated he hadn't read the reports. So this guy is making a judgment call on reports about whether it was safe or not and referring them to the DPP, hadn't read the reports, didn't know the expertise levels of the people who wrote the reports, and we're looking at each other saying, well, this is a peak health and safety body that, once again, I'll use a technical term, there's no fucking idea. And it's telling us it's safe. And all the statistics are saying, you've got to modify it. You've actually got to get better. You've got to make sure that you take prevention. And part of that is change the culture about bravery. Change the culture about team practices. Have longer out. Make sure we've got more staff, more players, so that gives them the time. So what did the AFL do? It reduced the lists. And what else did it do? It increased the number of games. And we know, right, the science tells us it's a number of games and the longer you play, right? Whereas in America, they're reducing the season size. This year, we've increased it. Now, who's putting their hand up? Is it Gil? Where's Gil? Gil's in France. He's gone to a wedding.
Lovely wedding.
A lovely wedding. So what does that tell you about his care? I would say a lot, you know? But we won't get political and we won't get personal, except in this case.
Outstanding job, Peter. Okay. Thank you both. Thank them both for their input. One of the important points that I want to recall with you all is that I hope you appreciate, and I'm sure and confident you do, with the questions that have been asked, with the amount of work and studies that have been done and the activity that has been prosecuted by John and Peter and others to do something about the sport. And your question about the AMA, etc., is an interesting question, having spent some time on federal government boards. And one thing I see from the AIS, having employed 17 sports scientists, etc., the matter of concussion, the leading body for handing out money and managing sport in this country, and I was there for only 10 years, is that any studies, any work on concussion has never been carried out. If we look what's happened in the UK, the terminology that we use, people marking their own homework. and without me prejudging what the Senate inquiry is going to say, I would reasonably expect that its findings are not going to be overly different than what's happened after the UK studies on this. And if there's one body on sport that needs to be congratulated, and I say it from my lengthy Olympic background, it's the Brits. When they tackle matters, they tackle them well. They're not dealing with states, they're not dealing with some of the issues that we are in this country. So you can take some pride to say that the British system is not a bad system in managing and guiding sport. And we would hope the Senate inquiry in Australia follows some of the examples set by our UK cheating cricketing brothers. It was with pleasure I invite Greg Griffin up. It's timely and opportune. I think you have to install some equipment, or can I proceed? You all okay to go? Right, so let me just give a bit of background to Greg. It's an outstanding background at law. Greg is a practicing lawyer, having been admitted to practice in 1981, and he's run his own legal firm since 1996, Griffin Lawyers, which specialises in law, corporate law, commercial litigation, and conducts a standalone sports advisory company, Griffin Sports. Greg is currently leading the Griffin Lawyers legal teams. 1, pursuing the class action, seeking damages in the Australian courts for former AFL players now suffering the effects of concussion injuries, which case in the claims brought by former NFL and NHL players in the United States. 2, the claims brought about by former AFL player Ty Zantac against Richmond Football Club and various club doctors engaged by it during his playing career at Richmond, alleging breaches of duty that have led to a probable onset of CTE. Representing the widow of the late Shane Tuck in the Victorian Coroner's Court coronial investigation into the death of Shane, who at the time of his death at 38 years of age in 2020 had entered into the final stages of CTE due to head injuries not properly treated by his former club Richmond during his career. Active, a prolific speaker in this area, from South Australia, a man of great legal background. Greg, welcome, and we look forward to the time of his death at 38 years of age in 2020. It ended into the final stages.
Firstly,
of
very
CTE
rarely do I get spoken of in
due
such
to head injuries not
kind
properly
terms,
treated by
and I think that
former
Andrew
club
has been
Richmond
far too kind.
during
But
his
anyway,
career.
I'll move on. Now, behind me as I
active,
speak,
a
you will
prolific
see,
speaker
without
in this area,
commentary,
from South Australia,
some of the
a man of great
video
legal background.
highlights that
Greg, welcome.
my
and we look
team
forward
has
to
put
the time of
together
his death at
since
38
about 7 years ago.
It ended into the final stages
Firstly,
of
very rarely
CTE
do I get together
due to head
and
injuries not
foolishly,
properly
one, I've
treated
paid
by
them, I
his
think that
former
Andrew has
club
been far too
Richmond
kind.
during
But
his
anyway,
career.
I agreed to do it. And
Now,
since
behind
then,
me as I speak,
Peter and I probably
you will
will
prolific
see
speaker in
without
this
closely
area,
in terms of
South
trying to put
Australia,
together
a man of great
video
legal background.
highlights.
position
Greg,
for
welcome.
my team has put together
since
about 7 years ago and overlooked
Firstly,
very rarely do I get
together.
So
Foolishly, one I've paid about 2 years ago I put together, I agreed to do it, and the team then, 6 people, whose job was to analyse certain games of AFL together. Because of the AFL is hardly cooperative in terms of what it's prepared to do. And overlooked the AFL doesn't do anyone any favours. 2 years ago, I put together, you're in their camp, well in their staff. So what we put together is gone to ICOS source games which are available on YouTube and other media outlets. And so I think we've got about a third of the games that are, or 30 to 40% of games that are relevant. And from that process, startling revelations come out. So there was a comment earlier as to Peter made it about Nathan Gibbs, the former club doctor for Sydney, who said that he thought that the concussions were overstated by about 2.5 times. Well, I think that's the greatest underestimation. I mean, well done, Nathan, because you're the only bloke that actually stood up and said what we all know. 10 years ago. It wasn't that popular to say that. But from what we've seen, if it's the reported numbers of concussions, it's not 2.5 times, it's probably about 500 times. I mean, it is such massive lie that's been legislated. Underestimation. I mean, well done, Nathan. No one who actually watches every game of said could possibly say there was one concussion 10 years ago. I mean, there were concussions. Wasn't that popular to say. So what we've done is we've just gone through, for the purpose of today, the three lead plaintiffs in judges call it the Griffins concussion class action, and the other one's called the Margalit class action. So I just pulled out I had my team put together highlights or examples of the number of concussions that each of the three lead plaintiffs, who are Catherine Tuck, who is the widow of Shane Tuck, as was discussed earlier. There's Darren Jarman, who is, anyone that knows football knows Darren, and Jay Schultz, who had a very strong career with both Richmond and Port Power. So bearing in mind that we've only looked at or been able to extract these highlights from about a third to 40% of the games, because that's all we're, as a matter of law, are entitled to access, you can see the number of concussions that each of Shane Tuck, Darren Jarman, and Ty, I think I've thrown Ty Zantuck as well, and Jay Schultz have suffered. Together, I mean, I think that the number of concussions that Jay Schultz, for example, suffered in his career, which at this stage, I think we're at 35, and that's not counting the 60% of games we haven't watched. I think Jay Schultz was taken off twice, and on one of those occasions he was put back on. So it's just absolutely bizarre and a huge discredit to the AFL clubs and to the AFL itself. They continue to perpetuate this story that concussions are limited in numbers, because just watch, I mean, okay, listen to me if you choose to, or just watch that in the background. What you see is incident after incident after incident. And in due course, when this litigation gets moving and we get a thing called disclosure or discovery, what's going to be most interesting is when we get hold of the AFL club doctors' records and the club's records as to how many of these events are actually recorded. Because I think you're going to find that there will be very few of them recorded, because the clubs have been absolutely conspiratorial, is the word I would use, with the AFL in promulgating the story that concussions don't occur in AFL football. Well, they do. Just by watching these edited highlights, and these are of 4 players. I mean, I forgot to mention Ty Zantuck, because he's not actually a member of the class action. He's bringing his own action in respect of really serious back injuries that he suffered after numerous back injections. And then in the course of us examining the films, because essentially Ty Zantuck, good bloke, played only 4 seasons, injuries curtailed his career. His back was so bad he couldn't continue. He played a season at, I think at Essendon in 2005, and that was his last season. So he retired too young. But in essence, the case that we've brought on behalf of Ty, and that was a referral from Peter, who he's actually recorded in the Supreme Court judgment, where we got an extension of time because we were 23 years out of time to bring the action, and the judge gave us the extension of time simply because we were able to show that there was no prejudice to Richmond Football Club. We said, oh, we can't defend this, is 23 years ago. I mean, how are we supposed to respond to any of this? So in the extension of time application, we had very senior Queen's Counsel representing us, who is probably the best class action lawyer in the country. So I won't mention he's a very modest man, but he is the best in the country. So we just then put up the videos of Ty, of those that we were allowed to show. And the judge of the Supreme Court said, well, what prejudice is there? I mean, we can all see what's happened to him. We can see that he's been concussed on numerous occasions, but we didn't start looking for concussions because Ty instructed me and Peter some years ago that he was basically numbed from chest down to his knees, so he could not feel pain. So to keep him going through the pain barrier, because they needed him to play. This was Richmond in 2000 through to 2004. And so what I was doing at that stage was trying to get some evidence to show that he was doing sort of superhuman things, and things that could not have been done had he been not numbed from chest to knees. And we're watching hours of these tapes, and it's actually quite disconcerting, you know, when you see someone who's quite frankly sacrificed on the altar of expediency, which is what happened to Ty Zantuck. So then the head of our team said, Greg, I've got all the stuff on the back injuries, but this bloke's had about 8 serious concussions. And I said, well, I didn't know, because he never told me he'd suffered concussions. And so then we actually pulled out the concussions, and there are some you'll see coming on, and some of them, even there are times when there's a collision between 2 Richmond players. They're both really completely concussed, right? They're both blood pouring everywhere. Richmond took off the other Richmond player and left Ty on. It's because Ty never went off. And it's that sort of mentality that has caused so much damage. But we have players who never got taken off after concussions. And when you see these things, you'll see a number of players Darren Jarman, we'll get to Darren, and it's a very interesting series of clips where Darren is actually knocked unconscious in the 1997 prelim against Western Bulldogs in the second quarter. So he's out. He's actually punched, and the player who did it got reported, but he was out. So the doctor's got him in the middle of the ground, and he's looking at the bench, saying, "What do we do?" And of course, instead of taking him off because he was seriously damaged, he got put in the forward pocket. It was a preliminary final. Adelaide were not doing well, and the coaching staff and the medical staff decided that their prospects of winning that prelim would be greatly enhanced by Darren Jarman being on the field and not being looked after in the rooms because he'd just been knocked unconscious. So Darren then, like all footballers, you do what the coach says, you stay on. If the doctor says you stay on, you stay on. So he goes to the forward pocket. In the third quarter, he gets absolutely cleaned up again. So it's the classic second impact syndrome. So Darren is concussed again. Not to worry, that's life because he's a professional AFL footballer. In the last quarter, he kicks 2 goals and hands out another one and wins the game. After the game, the doctor walks up to him and said, "How do you feel?" Darren looked at him. His response to that question was, "Who won?" Now, look, all of us that played football, if you ever kicked 2 in the last quarter and gave away a third, and you came back from 6 goals down, and you were the cause of that comeback, you probably know who won. So, and the next week, of course, he was put on the plane. He was flown home, brought back again to play in the grand final against St Kilda. Sorry, Andrew. And he kicked, 5 in the last quarter. So, I mean, basically, Adelaide Crows got a massive benefit from keeping Darren Jarman on the field that day. The question is, at what price? What price was paid for Darren to have done that? And you'll see that, I mean, Darren, like all good footballers, he copped more than his fair share. I mean, he got hit from pillar to post, is the truth of it. And you look at the videos for guys like David Brown, who played for the Crows in Port Adelaide. I mean, he's had numerous concussions and, you know, he's suffering. You look at Johnny Platten, who was terribly brave, and he's suffered numerous concussion events. And both of those will come out quite bluntly and say they're not feeling well. I mean, that's the polite way of saying it. So basically, that's why we're here, and what I'd like you to do is just watch some of those events and then ask me in about a year's time. Hopefully by then the action will be rolling on, and we'll see how many of these events are recorded. You'll note that I've actually not put down the dates of the games and the times it happens, because, you know, if I've spent 2 years doing this, I'm not going to give the AFL all of this stuff. And that's why all of this, there's a lot of intellectual property in this, and we'll be taking it with us. We're only showing it today just to give you some context as to what was actually happening out there, because, I mean, a lot of you have come here for different reasons. Some for medical interest, some because, you know, you're players, and I see Alan, and I see Barnesy, and I see other Chadder and Tour, which is great to see former players who are part of it coming along and showing interest. Then we've got Wendy Smith, who you probably don't know, who's the mother of Antonio, who died, 7 weeks ago? Yeah. I think what we've got is a wide variety of people, and we've got people who have got different reasons for being here. We've got parents, friends, loved ones. We've got players, we've got officials, we've got doctors, we've got accountants, we've got lawyers. But what we've got is a common theme, which is what happened from about the 1980s onwards, where footballers were basically treated as chattels, really. And they were just performers at Circus Maximus. Then there has to be some manner of compensation for those players who are now suffering. And John Barnes has been very brave in his public comments. I mean, he's come out and given some very, you know, quite frankly, difficult to read articles about how, you know, we all loved watching John Barnes play football. He was a bloody good footballer. But now he's paying the price. And we've also read about, I mean, I was actually meeting with Peter one day in Melbourne, and then I read the front page of the Herald Sun about Jay Schultz. And Jay, who actually works for the AFL, he works in the Tasmanian AFL, was saying, look, I think I've had lots of concussions and I'm struggling. Well, he has had a lot of concussions. I mean, we're 35 and counting. I mean, no person should have 35 concussions in any workforce. I mean, you shouldn't have 3 concussions in any workforce. But you can have a concussion, because what a concussion is resolved by is a thing called rest. And that is the thing which people have got to come to grips with. And that's what Peter and John was speaking about earlier in terms of, is it 6 days, is it 12 days, is it 21 days? Well, the reality is, if it's 38 days, and that's when you recover, that's what it is. It's not, there's no set magic. And what, obviously the 12 days was set magic, because it enabled every player to only miss 1 game. So you never miss 2. So basically there was no science to it. It was purely expedience and an intention of the AFL to make sure that all players that they wanted on the park were not kept off because of a concussion injury. And basically, there have been, in international sport, back from the 60s onwards, rugby union, had a 21-day period of rest, and the word is rest, after a concussion. And that's because rugby union is actually played by people who, a lot of them are, very well educated. I mean, that's no polite way of saying that. And there's a lot of neurosurgeons who played for Ireland and things like that. There's whole families of neurosurgeons who played for Ireland. And so there was always a focus on the medical aspect of treating concussions. Now, suddenly they'll go from a 21-day period to no period, because when they created the Super Rugby competition after the World Cup, the Rugby Union World Cup in South Africa, the broadcaster who was paying the money so you could have teams from Japan, South America, South Africa and all that, said, you don't get our broadcast, you don't get our funding unless you get rid of this 21-day period. So rugby had the choice, did they maintain their position as a safe and intelligent sport, or did they take the money? And like all good sporting administrators, they took the money. And there was outrage. I mean, particularly the Irish, because they, quite apart from the fact that, I've got Irish blood, therefore I barrack for Ireland, but quite apart from that fact, the Irish team were very, very opposed to the changing of those rules. So basically, the rest of world sport suddenly had no marker to be judged by. So 21 days was a good period, and it worked pretty effectively anyway. So suddenly rugby league, AFL, NFL, they couldn't be assessed against a reasonable basis upon which players should be returned to play. Now, return to play is what the legal cases are all about. In 1986, a doctor called Bob Cantu out of Boston, he was a very close colleague of Anne McKee, who is probably the most famous CTE researcher and brain specialist in the world. So Bob Cantu, who had been in his own right a very eminent neurologist, published his very famous return to play protocols, which set out how a player that is concussed should or is going to be returned to the field of play, either at training or on match day. Now, these protocols set out very clearly that any concussed player should not return to the field of play on the day of a concussion. Now, you will see from those numerous events, just watching that one, that unless the player is actually knocked out, 90% of these players stay on the field. And so what we've done in preparation for this case is we've also had neurologists examine the actual response from the players after the incident. There are telltale signs of a concussion. If you're concussed in a collision, your body language thereafter is something which the neurologists actually have very serious regard to, because there are certain giveaways, like where your hands go, what do you do with your head and things like that. And so, quite apart from the fact that you can see that some players must have been concussed because they've been thrown face first into the ground with the sling tackles, which are now banned, thank God. But there's also, when the player gets up and if he shows certain signs, then the neurologist can say with a fairly strong degree of certainty that there has been a concussion. So what we've managed to do is, by applying those criteria, or that criteria, we've been able to put numbers on concussions, and we're being able to say with a degree of confidence that on any certain event that resulted in the player being concussed. The difficult thing, of course, is most players that I've spoken to, has been 100 of them, I can assure you, they seriously underestimate the amount of concussions that they suffered. And I was talking to a Richmond player the other day, and he was sort of saying, oh, look, I've got problems, my work's not going that well, and it's sort of, you hear it every day. And I said, well, I know you have. And he said, well, how do you know that? And I said, because by watching all of Shane Tuck's games and watching Ty Zantuck's games, and you played in virtually all of them, I've got you down on 9 concussions. Oh, that's bullshit. I said, all right. So I actually said, I'll email it to you. So I had my team just go bang, bang, and I sent him a little video clip like this of his concussions. We weren't looking for him. They were just, whilst we were watching Zantuck and Tuck, we were also just seeing some players continually getting hit and continually being injured. So, and the moment this bloke rang me, I mean, I knew he'd been, because I'd seen his name on the list and I'd seen some of the things. So I sent it over, and he rings me up in about an hour's time and said, I'm really very dirty on you. I said, oh, okay, fine. I'm used to being abused. And I said, what's the problem? He said, no, I'm not dirty on you. I'm dirty on the club. They used me. And so he went from being, is this really something I should be involved, to becoming a very angry person, because he actually saw, probably for the first time, how many serious knocks he had taken. And he said, that explains why I get headaches, why my moods are awful, why my partner, tells me to go and see someone. Because, I've wondered. And then he said, is it just me? And the number of players that have actually said to me, well, I just thought it was me. I didn't know that this, with all the publicity around concussion, you'd be very surprised to know that many players are very reticent to come forward because they don't want to sound like they're weak. They're not weak. I mean, they've got issues, and there are issues that, quite frankly, there are steps you can take to mitigate them, but in many cases, they're issues that are there for life. And so, I mean, that requires some seriously good medical treatment going forward. And it also involves us trying to get doctors to take this seriously. And Wendy and I have spent some time in the last few weeks looking at previous records, and if certain doctors had a very different approach to concussion in sport, Wendy might not be here today. It's simple as that. I mean, if doctors aren't prepared to actually accept that concussions and headaches and all these things which many of you in this room either have suffered or your partners have suffered, and unless doctors treat this as being a genuine and serious medical problem, they're not going to then give the proper advice, which is stop playing. Or if you get concussed again, think about whether you should continue. Or if you are concussed, do not go back and play the next day. Do not go back on the field. What you have to do is just look after yourself. And part of this class action is about building some firewalls around the players. And we've got player managers here. I mean, obviously Peter was, and we've got Ricky over there. And basically, this is an all-of-game approach. It's not just something that we can hold the coach responsible for, or the CEO, no matter how highly he is paid, of a football club for. I mean, this has got to be something which we all take seriously. And so, we all I was watching the game Sydney v Port Adelaide, I don't know, about 2 or 3 months ago, and a player who had been concussed on a number of occasions was involved in what appeared to be a fairly innocuous tackle. And basically he just went down, and you'd expect him to hop straight back up, and he didn't. He did not get back up. And I was watching it with a Port Adelaide supporter, my daughter's boyfriend, and he said, he shouldn't be concussed after that. And I said, well, the reason he is concussed is because of the number of previous concussions, he is susceptible to much greater effect from subsequent knocks. And that is undoubtedly the situation that we will find in respect of Antonio. And that's because clubs and doctors don't take this seriously. I mean, basically, I don't want to. I mean, we've got the film. We know exactly what happened. When we got the AFL spin on what happened about it being a cardiac arrest, and the moment it was, I rang two people. I rang my mate is a senior cardiologist who was extremely dubious about a 21-year-old boy having such a cardiac arrest when he was young, healthy, and fit. And then when I said, oh, there was a head injury, he said, well, if there's a head injury and it was serious, well, the body just closes down and the brain stops the blood flow to the heart. So, I mean, I found that out in 2 phone calls, and I spoke to Peter, of course, who then gave me a 3-hour lecture on it. I really regretted calling him. You think that this sort of, when he goes on a question, this is rare. This is not rare. Every time I speak to him, I get another 2-hour medical discussion, which I can't charge anyone for listening to either, I might add, which is very disappointing. So in essence, what we have is we have not enough knowledge. The knowledge is there. The knowledge has been suppressed, and it's been suppressed by those who wanted AFL to be watched. And basically, the NFL case is a very interesting precedent legally, because the NFL stridently fought the concept of CTE concussion for 25, 30 years, right? Now, what they did was they followed word for word the tobacco industry playbook, because people were saying for years and years that smoking caused cancer. And for years and years, the people sued and always lost, because the tobacco industry had so many doctors on side who would come along and give evidence that there was no plausible medical evidence to link the onset of lung cancer to smoking. And they got away with it for 30 years. And suddenly, when the dam broke, everything changed. And that's why I don't smoke, but you've got a pack of cigarettes, you've got photographs of people without teeth, and all horrible things, all of which smoking is directly causative of. So the NFL followed that playbook, and so they had all their doctors saying that this concussion stuff is nonsense, it doesn't exist, and they got away with it. And there was a thing called the Concussion in Sports Group, which heralded itself as the world leaders, the world authorities, and they were a collection of very good surgeons from around the world. But there were also, on their boards, were people who were so clearly conflicted. They were the doctors for the NFL, they were the doctors for the NHL, they were the doctors for AFL, they were the doctors for rugby. And of course, that influenced all of those recommendations, because none of the, even though everyone took as Bible what they said in their reports, they were just consensus statements. They were statements, and basically there were people like Bob Cantu on those boards, and I said, well, I met with him in Massachusetts, and I said, tell me your names on 2 or 3 of these CISG consensus statements, and he said, well, the numbers were there. He said, I mean, I'm there, I didn't agree with it, but what they never showed was who pushed it and who didn't. So basically, that's how the NFL and all the major sporting bodies controlled the perception of what the medical science was. Now, the medical science, there was a very large body of medical science that was totally against what was coming out of those CISG reports, okay? Now, it was only until the NFL case started to go to trial and all the medical then discovery, and then everybody discovered the NFL knew for years and years what the true situation was. So they coughed up $1 billion. Now, the reason I mentioned the relevance of the NFL case is that the AFL, just as the NFL followed the tobacco industry playbook, the AFL, since about 1980 or thereabouts, has followed word for word the NFL playbook. And just as it went, the Italians would say, to murder, so that's so I don't have to say it goes to shit. As night follows day, as it went to shit for the NFL, it will go that way, I strongly suspect, for the AFL, because what the AFL has done is it has put forward medical positions for many years that were convenient to it, but were simply unsustainable. And had the AFL, back in 1986, adopted all or part of the Bob Cantu return to play protocols, many of the players who are now suffering might have no symptoms, might have much lesser symptoms. And that's the essence of the legal claim that's being brought by, in the class action, which is you've got all of these footballers who did suffer concussions, often stayed on the park, never had sufficient time to rest, and that thereafter that meant that the injuries never properly settled, and a concussion that doesn't settle is a very dangerous beast because it makes you susceptible to worse damage if you are concussed again whilst the first concussion or the second concussion or the 37th concussion remains unresolved. So that's going to be the battleground, and that's the state of knowledge, whether the AFL knew or ought to have known from at least 86 onwards. That's the date, that's the line in the sand that we've drawn. Whether they should have introduced proper return to play protocols. And I mean, I'm sure players like Sean Smith sitting here, I mean, Sean's, again, he's been very brave in coming out and saying that as a result of the concussions he suffered, I mean, he told me once he doesn't remember taking the mark of the century. Well, I mean, that's a terrible story for me. I mean, if I'd taken a mark like that, let me tell you, I think about it every day. The truth is I never took a mark like that, Steve. Sean. So basically that's what the claim is. The claim involves us as lawyers working for injured people, trying to establish, our job is to establish that the AFL well knew what should have been done and chose not to do it. And a big part of our statement of claim, it's not part of the other legal firm's statement of claim, is that the AFL worked feverishly to set aside the recommendations of the National Health and Research Medical Council, which back in 1984 made the same sort of recommendations and adopted the Bob Cantu and the rugby union approach in terms of return to play. So for 10 years there was in place a directive from the NHMRC, a federal government medical body, which the federal government funds rugby and AFL and all those contact sports, and therefore should have been in a position to say, well, if you don't follow our recommendations or our guidelines, we'll just take away your funding. But they never did it, so they're also culpable, but that's government. But what they did was the AFL and rugby, they just ignored the report. They didn't agree with it, so they didn't implement it. At the end of every 10 years of an NHMRC report, it is then subject to revision by an independent panel to make sure that the science that was applied 10 years earlier was still scientifically correct. And there are only 2 submissions against which said the 1984 report had to be set aside because the medical evidence was unsafe, and they came from the Neurosurgeons Association and the General Practitioners Association, both of whom appointed the same specialist to give the report, and that specialist was Paul Macquarie. So he is single-handedly responsible. The only 2 submissions against it were his submissions. And so the independent body, faced with a report that had been in place for 10 years, wiped it. And they wiped it on the basis they said the medical evidence was unreliable. The medical evidence today would be found to be totally and absolutely correct. It was correct then and it's correct now. So basically for 10 years, the Rugby League and the AFL simply did not follow the guidelines. then they had the guidelines condemned to the trash basket. So basically, they knew what they should have done. They chose not to do it, and they even went a step further, and they worked actively to basically prevent their being in place, or prevent government imposing upon them these sort of return to play protocols, which, had they been brought in, I suggest would have resulted in a much healthier game. And I share the views of Peter, and then John, who worked tirelessly, which is the game's great, but you've got to protect the players. And the game will still be great with protected players. Basically they've stopped the sling tackle. Well, how is the game worse for that? Of course it's not. But you'll see sling tackles in there, and you just see how damaging they were. But for years and years, no sanctions. And the AFL, they continue to dominate this sphere. I'm from South Australia, and you've got the South Australian National Football League, which controls all the country leagues and the suburban leagues. And they set out the concussion policies. After the passing of Antonio, the SANFL, in an act of, I think, massive stupidity, what they've done is they've now removed from the regulations of the country leagues and the suburban leagues their concussion policy. They've just taken it out. Now, there's a reason for that, and that's because they don't want to be held accountable for it. The concussion policy was actually pretty reasonable. It was never enforced, which is their problem, and it's a massive problem for them going forward. But it just shows just how powerful the AFL is, that it can actually determine South Australian country football regulations. You're talking about a body that has complete and absolute control over the whole game, and that's why the clubs when we've sued the clubs, the other firm hasn't. We've done it we think the clubs and the club doctors who allow players who are clearly concussed to remain on the field are liable, and we don't think that they can just point to the AFL and say, well, that's their fault. Well, it's a tripartite agreement, which means that there's three parties. The three parties to every contract is the player, the AFL club, and the AFL itself. And so the reason that we've sued the clubs as well as the AFL is that what we don't want is a situation of the AFL then saying, well, it wasn't us. I'm sorry, I've gone far too long. If I can quickly say, thank you, John, on another point about the Brits, Andrew, you mentioned how good they are. Well, I read the House of Commons report, and the one thing they did, the one thing that struck them, apart from being a very good report, is they were very highly critical of the Football Association, which all the Premier League players are members of. They were very uncooperative in their report and took a very negative approach to there being any change to concussion rules. And so the actual House of Commons criticised the Players' Union for not actually doing what it should have been doing, is protecting the players. The reason I mention that is the criticisms of the AFLPA are absolutely echoed by me, having sat through and endured the ongoing coronial investigation of the death of Shane Tuck. Tuck removed herself because the coroner would not investigate the circumstances leading up to why he, at the age of 37, had stage 4 CTE, because he had numerous untreated concussions. So she said, well, this is going nowhere, and pulled out. And the AFLPA, every time the AFL put a submission, which was against us being able to get, for example, the coroner to look at these tapes, the coroner wouldn't look at the tapes. We wouldn't look at the circumstances, he wouldn't examine why Shane was so damaged. The AFLPA supported them on every application. So I absolutely echo the earlier statements about what is the AFLPA doing. It's not just about money, it's about looking after your players, and I don't think it does that. So on a beautiful parting note, that's what I'll say. So thank you.
I know time-wise, Greg, thank you for that. I think there's a good degree of cynicism in this room for reasons there should be. Having been involved with some sinister actions in regards to my position at the Australian Sports Commission when the Liberal government interfered with sports rorts, I just say to all of you that has ever dealt with federal or state governments, welcome to the world of cynicism. Greg, just one question before we transfer over. The issue with this class action that you are taking, what's the agenda? There's many in the room that are going to take an enormous interest in this. Would you just like to make a closing comment on that?
Sure. At the moment, I'll give you a quick snapshot. We've already been in the Supreme Court for Justice Dixon. We've been called back in late August, September, and at that time, Justice Dixon will give further directions as to how the class action is to proceed, because there are two class actions, plus he's joined in those actions Ty Zantuck. He wants the Zantuck matter. In fact, he recommended that, he made the comment that he was surprised the AFL had not been joined to the Zantuck proceedings, which is, as we speak, being done. So you've got that, and you've got the Gary Ablett action, and Ablett said he doesn't want to be tied up in anybody else's, and the judge basically said, well, it's my court and I'll make those decisions. I think he was god of the football park, but his influence doesn't quite extend to the Victorian Supreme Court. So basically there will be directions hearing. I think there will be lots of legal arguments, extensions of time. It'll be about a 2-year, I would have thought, interlocutory battle. Both sides know we know what they're like. I think I've had more actions against the AFL than anyone else, I'm pleased to say. Starting in 1995, 94, when I got an injunction stopping Port Adelaide going into the AFL. And that's when my opponent in that was a fellow called Jeff Brown, who is now, of course, the president of Collingwood. And we became actually good friends after that, despite the fact that created the Crows, because Port were told they couldn't go in, and thereupon a deal was done and the Adelaide Crows were formed. So since that time, we've done a lot of, we did the Sean Wren case, which the AFL fought very hard and then collapsed. We did the case at Subiaco when everyone was doing ACLs. That's because what they were doing was they were deliberately not watering the flank and the pocket, so that when the ball was bounced, the Victorians would come from the wet mud of Moorabbin and they'd try and bounce the ball and it'd go back over their heads. So there's been lots of court actions. The AFL are very experienced litigants, and I expect that we'll probably have a battle for the next 2 or 3 years, Andrew.
Good luck.
Thanks.
We wish you luck. Thank you, Greg. I just wish, Greg, you'd taken up the injunction on injured player from the Adelaide Football Club before that grand final, but we move on. The personal next item on the agenda is a personal experience. Those that have lived with the issues that we've discussed for the last few hours. We have on the line, I think from the UK, Peter Venables. Sorry? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. I can talk for a couple of minutes. So we've got Peter Venables, who is the father of Daniel Venables, and it's a compelling story. Young man, drafted number 13 draft, I think, in 2017, played in the West Coast Eagles grand final as a 19-year-old guy, suffered some horrendous injuries, and his father has been most supportive, as his family has. And I know that Peter would like to talk about that. Sean, we welcome you to come up and join it. Greg, you're back up on deck on this matter. And Wendy Smith over there. Wendy, welcome to you. And I know a little bit about the story about your son Antonio and the experiences you have gone through, and we thank you and applaud you for coming up and wanting to talk about these issues. We were hoping to get Justin Koziski. It's his daughter's birthday today with Justin, and I've got a few notes from Justin, and perhaps I can add this on in the end. Peter, it's probably best you come up and speak and introduce. You've been involved with everybody here, other than perhaps Wendy. So if you'd like to act as the person of introduction and making any relevant comments, I think that would be appreciated. You know everyone here. You happy to do that, Peter?
Mr. President, I'm at your beck and call.
Please, here. So we've a minute to go. So if you'd all like to come up, and there's a chair here. I don't know what we're doing for microphones, but we'll find a way of coordinating that and allow you to introduce everybody, Peter, and we'll talk about personal experiences. When it comes to Justin, I can make a few comments regarding Justin.
Chad, do you want to come up? Might as well. Tread the boards. Good on you, mate. It'll be soft. Right, we have Chad Rintoul, Sean Smith, Wendy Smith, and Gregory Griffin at the end of the table. So I've been in this journey. I first started out in footy about 40 odd years ago, and I was dealing with a cohort of about 130 fit young men who were bulletproof. Nothing would stop them, and over that journey now, I'm seeing them in their 50s and 60s, and in some cases, the transition is just incredible from what they were to what they are today and what it looks like going forward. I once described it to a friend of mine as that when you've got a brain trauma, the only person who really knows what is happening is you, because it's extremely difficult to try and articulate what is actually happening to you, because you present physically quite normal. You know, you think, well, there's nothing wrong with you. You're a big, strong, lad. But, once you walk in somebody's shoes who's had a brain trauma, you actually then start to understand how it affects their mood, behaviour, and the people that actually can relate to it are their family and friends, more so than, the guys themselves. Because what happens is, the guys then trend into what they consider to be a normal situation. So they move into a new normal, and that new normal grates against the people who they are with. Anger management is one of the issues that they deal with. Memory loss, short-term memory loss, confusion, anxiety, depression are some of the problems that manifest themselves in brain trauma. Now, the interesting thing is this: is that the medicine and science says that you actually get better from a concussion. Well, what we're finding is that once you have structural damage, that structural damage is permanent. It may only be small, and in many cases, you can actually create collateral strategies that make it very small. But in a number of cases, you have repeat dysfunctional behaviour, and a lot of the people we're dealing with who go to see psychiatrists and other people get treated for the presentation. That is, they get treated on the basis that you present with dysfunctional behaviour, therefore it's organic. So the principal treatment has historically been mood drugs, where they modulate people's behaviour to, take away the swings and roundabouts. And so, people then present while they're on their drugs as normal. Once they're removed from that, quite, catastrophic things can happen, as we saw in the case of Danny Frawley when he went off his meds, and he's not the only one, unfortunately, that we've had to deal with. But it is an issue, it's a live issue, and the thing that presents to me the most is a complete lack of support for the families. Complete lack of support for the wives, complete lack of support for the kids. And I likened it to what we saw after the Second World War, when we had all these fine young men who were damaged from blasts coming back and trying to move themselves into society. But time and time again, they had no place that was safe because, the war had created such an extent in terms of brain damage that the toll was absolutely, in terms of the wives and the families of returned vets, it was horrific. And that's one of the things that I can relate to, because my dad was a veteran. I mean, he went to war at 16 and he came home at 22. And he was a gunner and fired, the mortar rounds and all, the heavy artillery. And what we now know is that the shock waves from the blasts are just as catastrophic as, a car crash. So what I saw with my dad, it was this change in behaviour, change in mood, and how it had an impact on our family unit. And now I'm seeing exactly this type of thing with these young men who are now middle-aged, are still struggling with all the sorts of consequences of when they've had that brain trauma. And it's, if we talk to them, you've got to understand how brave they are to actually talk, when you've had a brain trauma. It's very, very, difficult to, come out in the public and state, well, I'm really changed. I'm not the person that I was. And unfortunately, the longitudinal studies tell us is that once you start to walk towards the blackness of, dementia, there's absolutely no turning back. There is going to come a time when, the family and friends will have to support these guys more than what people know is that, they transition from being wives and partners into carers. That's a frightening thing, and we're seeing it, now is that you've got 300 past players taking that step of suing the peak body to try and get, the basic rights of trying to fix them anyway. So, yeah.
We're all set to go there with Peter.
Yeah, yep. Now, this is a very, contemporary view. This is Peter, Venables, who's living and breathing it with his 24-year-old son. He had a collision on field. He was unconscious, I think, for 5 or 10 minutes, was taken off the field, left in the sheds. No proper process was followed that the AFL has in its rule book, and said that, if you fail the Glasgow coma score, you go straight into the emergency ward. He was left in the sheds, and then his girlfriend drove him home. And then at midnight or sometime after that, he was rushed back thinking that his head was going to explode because he had 7 bleeds on his brain. This is an elite sport, and we've had third world, treatment. And when you're involved in brain trauma, you actually know it's time critical. The sooner that you actually get to the cause of the problem and stop it, the better the outcome. If you don't, you actually then have the situation whereby, the damage becomes permanent and you have some significant long-term problems. Anyway, I'll pass it over to Pete. Pete? You there, mate? You're on. I think. Technology. It's a beauty. What are we doing? Pete?
Just, I don't think he can hear us.
Okay, well, just tell him to start. Can we text him so we can have a chat? I'll text him. The wonders of modern science. You can see why I don't have a computer. I'm a Stone Age man. I write everything. And I don't have any problems with viruses. I don't have any problems with getting hacked. I'll see if I can get him. Stone Age technology, a mobile phone. Right. We can hear him. Yeah, good. All right, mate. It's all yours. Yep. 10-4, check, Roger. Yep, Ken. How are you, mate? Yep, if you can just tell people your journey with Dan and
I checked the sound. Sound's working. Working right.
right.
Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you. You're fine.
Can't hear you.
Yeah. Well, I just.
Sorry. Yeah,
A bit of Auslan. Rightio. You can talk. You can talk. We will listen. Yeah, let's get a piece of paper. You got a piece of paper and I'll say, Peter, talk. Got all these technocrats here, like me. Hey, Pete.
I'll take help this.
Yeah, can we turn the volume up?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very proud of Dan. I suppose the key things that I can't cover some of you guys have gone through all this yourselves. I can't cover the probably what's happened in a few minutes for the last 4 years. But just to say, for those who don't know Dan's story, Dan was drafted in 2016, placed in Eagles 2018, grand final. 2019 against Melbourne, he suffered a hit, which is nothing to see on Google, etc. And suffered a second brain, which had a shock at work, come home with the damage that happened there, and watch on TV, something that I'm sure these guys will appreciate, but something that was just devastating there. But we've taught our children to have a cracking life and not give up, so we certainly, Dan was given a go, and I'm very proud of how he's actually reacted. So I suffered convulsions, knocked out, especially accessed by the 2 doctors, and said the answer was to send him home with his girlfriend and his doctor. And that's seriously what happened. During the next day, Dan rang me the next morning, actually, he rang me, he said, my head's exploding down. And I said, yeah, he said, mate, come on, go to the doctors. So he rang the doctors and hospital had some scans. And again, he says, found out issues, but again, told him to go home and to rest. So during that period, is that obviously extreme migraines, pressure in the head, is he like bed darkness? And I know some of the guys who have experienced what Dan's gone through, they understand what they mean sitting in darkness for weeks, not just for days, weeks. Loss of memory, what actually happened, and obviously felt consistently sick. June 1 came over 13 to the our friend Dr. Corey, so I think a few of you guys have had experience with them again. Suggested some rest and took some antidepressants. We go to a meeting, Dr. Corey, and we were there for an hour. He just sitting there talking with us. To some who's and I got funny and repetitive. They used to do it so I can't just sit. That actually, to me, that was probably the hardest part to watch the game, to just to be told by these experts that time will be fine, and again, gives that breakfast. That's as simple as it gets. I can't be as simple. I found a recommendation was Corey was a AFL spokesperson for the expert. So it was 12 months. Pretty long 12 months. I watched my son as he came back to Melbourne from Perth, laying in bed and trying to, I don't know, just survive, I suppose. The biggest issue we had was I was watching and you know, watching his son go into depression like he was, and planning with him every day, and he get up and in a very short period of time, down deteriorated from a fit AFL footballer to a very, very sad state. Again, his emotions like that in the room. So basically, that's what Dan's was. That's what he had. I don't say it's crazy, but that's what his actual work. That's what basically the book is helpful most. With a lot of the doctor. I was checking, the doctors checked, but obviously there was no, they actually had no answer. And that was probably the biggest thing I couldn't understand it as a family and a professional outfit, that it was so disjointed, unprofessional, unstructured, non-structured, and they weren't prepared for what happened to them. But again, all we did was actually follow the rules, so we didn't quite understand this very well. We didn't know what was happening, but by this time we started thinking what's going on. Daniel, he explained it correctly. He explained actually came to he's lost confidence. He said, I can't keep taking it. I'm going to get healed. And that's pretty sad situation watching that occurred. He said that to me, and I don't believe in this. I'm not spoken. I don't believe in this. What the stop is telling. And he felt that he knew the young man. He knew what was happening, and plenty of tears went through in that time. And there's actually Daniel started his own investigation, and he's was just talking around, and I know he's talking to Dave Carpenter and some of the other guys, and that's when I found met individual talked to me about Brett, and I think Brett said, I think your finger, Jesse, Brett there, yeah.
Not, yeah, coming.
Brett, I just met you personally. I was trying to say this. I've spoken to you for many times, and I spoke to you in Miami, etc., when I was talking about the trust. But I just want to publicly thank you very much for what the time and not just working out there, but also just the connection and the care, I suppose. And so I just want to publicly say that. Because the day you met you, and I think that the big difference in values should change. He gave something proactive, he gave us an exercise, you explained to him what was going on. You didn't treat him as symptoms, just walk in and see a doctor. The doctor said, oh, take some tablets, and you explained the situation, you taught him, you gave him knowledge which others weren't prepared to do. I don't think I say that not just flippantly. One of the things I have learned about is situation is that the data, and it's new, and they're learning things all the time. So Brett, publicly, thank you. I wouldn't be happy personally on that. But I think more than anything, Brett gave you hope, and you gave it something to have a go at. So for that, in the next, for a period of 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks for a while, we had all these exercises. Brett, I think you're the expert, so I think you obviously explained to what you did. But he had exercises right around the house, all his places in the kitchen. I'd get up at 1 o'clock in the morning, Dan would be actually doing these exercises. And he would be consistently doing it. It was giving him a lot of pain to do it, but he kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And obviously started making a little difference. So thank you, Brett. I appreciate that. 2 days on in March, Dan tried to get back the trains. So he did try to go back to the Eagles, but the damage was done. He couldn't do it, but he used to train the Eagles and go home and sleep and never know. No, he just go home. He would actually, that's all you do, train and go to. So back by the, I don't know if Jesse's told the situation, but in July 2021, the panel, Ben's first player of the AFL medical board, and they officially said that he could play more of the conditions or 3 experts in that situation. And it was obviously listed by part of 2021. The thing that we get up, and Jesse said in there, Jesse's interesting character, and he's very, very passionate. And he helped us. One of the things the medical board said was basically that we needed help or program. That was 12 months of fighting that before we finally got them sent to Miami to get some 4 weeks of very extreme treatment, which again, Brett knows Dr. David Truston in Miami, and that was just amazing stuff. The fact that we had to, Brett again is the special team about it, was just the equipment that Danny was allowed to utilise and is not allowed to be utilised in Australia as such. But it showed very quickly just how just how the American scene is and just how difficult finding the Australians and how narrow-minded and simple-minded that Australia, AFL, specifically we're talking here, but obviously not just the AFL, was, and how not open to new information. And that 4 weeks, I'll tell you about 5 over a few minutes, but I can't explain the amount of information and things that Dan would go through. And again, Brett will be able to explain exactly that. But it made a difference to Dan. Again, it just gave me the ability to actually just live, I suppose, that's the back and system. When pain and you get access to whatever, etc., and you still got issues, but at least you can operate by the best thing. Just the last 12 months, Dan's symptoms, they continue, he obviously has continued rehabilitation. He's doing something every day, he's having operations, he's had a couple of operations on his neck. He's very good at masking issues. He's very good, and I'm sure that's pretty common from just will tell you that people with these amazing athletes, people who have these damage that have done the right ability to operate in life and just to put up with things that most people wouldn't be able to. So he's still getting there, he's still trying, he's probably failed, but I think the summary of what I wanted to do, what I wanted to say was, down just where we've been is very similar. We've met so many people with the same stories. Down in that fact, like continue for everything. And basically, we see it by the same for you guys. Simply we understood and respect what the issue is. And people do not want to, do not understand it. You don't have to really understand it. You're obviously more of a to value it. it's just been to West Coast doctors, they acknowledge, I mean, they're in a situation clear from the damage done. He has PrEP scan, pre-scan before he went to drive. In fact, there was damage done to him. So none of that is denied. It's just that they don't have the whole process to do what is happening, what is just them, not just them for everyone. And it's just so simple, you can see it, it's so clear they don't. And yet they refer to the wrong people. They go into this, and a lot of money, time, and effort, yet they don't communicate with people who are actually going through it, which is, well, I was going to say it was an argument all the time. The AFL board acknowledges the injuries, but has, again, no process to deal with it in a consistent manner. So what I think the summary what I've learned is that we actually need to be proactive. Brett knows very good mates with Dr. Trasker in Miami, etc. I mean, they have processes in place, so they understand, but they don't listen to the AFL. So the AFL is trying to listen. They want to control the narrative. They want to control the process. And they're prepared to put people on hold, like people's lives on hold, and even worse. Because it's not it's something they want to control. You know, it's really as simple as that. But there's the solution. I mean, obviously, there's sort of these. Well, I always see Concussion and this issue is something that in 10, 20 years' time, there's technology advances, the data comes in, we look back and go, well, we know what those. But we are, right now, we're the people who actually met us and obviously hundreds of other people are the ones who are actually collateral damage as we're working through this. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating. Acknowledge that. It's but let's work together. Dan, as like everybody else says, the right to live the best he can and be respectful of the condition that most people would understand and have some people actually some competitive with it. And just like I think the key thing is that there's just a simple process, a simple place for these guys to be consistently have a resource to go to. Is something that I think is just a no-brainer. So, Jesse, I actually have anything that what else you need. Yep, I see it. You go to the other house and no, thank you. All good. Cheers.
Thanks, Pete. It's a tragic case, but it's one that we're going to follow over a long period of time, and we'll track and see how Dan goes. But I mean, as a parent, he's frustrated at every stage, and you can only imagine how a parent would feel with, a 19-year-old that's been taken over to the other side of the country. He's been handed to a footy club, and he comes back brain damaged. It's, it's almost frightening to try and work, a way how you would deal with that. So what we've got here is a group of guys who have played footy, experienced it. Alan Stoneham's on the end. Sean, Chad, Greg and Wendy, all have got different experiences. And I think, we can just have a quick snapshot of, your life, just in terms of the number of concussions you think you had and, what do you think and sort of how it's changed your life. Chad, you can just a quick one. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bert, and everybody. I'm not much of a talker, so I'll do my best. Thanks, Greg, as well for coming over. Yeah, I got concussed. I don't know, honestly, how many times. 12, maybe more. I don't know. I retired because of it, and.
Do you want to stand up here, mate?
Yeah. Okay.
We'll get out of the way.
Yeah, no, I retired from footy and I took a year off basically. I was just in bed for basically a year, and I went back up north. I'm from the Pilbara in West Australia, and just pretty much got back to nature and didn't work. Just went fishing and diving and surfing, so that helped a lot. And now I just, I really notice it now a lot. I just meditate a lot and, geez, just do the best I can. I've got 2 boys. They play footy, so I support them as well. And it's pretty simple. I just do the best I can with what I got. It's good. I got some scans last year with Peter. Peter's been good to identify some issues and deal with them. And I'm glad that this is happening. We're getting involved and meeting some other people and, yeah, going ahead with it. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
How are we going? Obviously, I've been quite proactive with the concussion side of things. So, yeah, it had a massive influence in my life. When I look at the concussions that I've had, I had been knocked out and basically carted off about 14 times. And then I see these other concussions on there before. What was on there before was, I think, I don't know how many I've had of those. It was countless, I would say. But what, obviously the AFL aren't learning anything, because I look at someone like Jeremy Cameron, who got knocked out 2-3 weeks ago, and I was at the game because they were playing Melbourne. My son plays for Melbourne, and even my son said he was out in the ground and he said he was in a bad way, and yet he's playing tomorrow night, which is just wrong. Yeah, just the influence it's had. Obviously, mood. Everyone talk about mood, and anger, and yeah, it's not a good place to be when the switch goes. It's pretty ugly, and I'm a lover, not a fighter, because I can't fight. Yeah, it's just it's an unseen thing, and Mel, my partner's here, and we've only known each other for a short term, and she's seen the impact it's had on me, and obviously it impacts Mel as well. So, my kids, really has a massive impact. So we just need to be more proactive about stopping the concussions, but things are going to happen on the ground. But it's also about the recovery or the trying to deal with it, and I guess that's where I'm sort of trying to come from now, is that I haven't had a drink for nearly 4 years, and that's been an absolute game changer for me. So, and some natural stuff and some medication as well, and some really good support. That's really been it's really made me better, a better person, and functioning better. I'm never going to be perfect, but I just want to be functioning properly. And I have my moments where, in some weeks, I'm not good, but then I bounce back, and I have more days that are better than not, because in the past, it was just doom and gloom every day. So there is hope. If you are struggling, there is hope to make yourself slightly better, so you can actually function and be a good human. So yeah, but unfortunately the AFL aren't listening, and when you have to sue someone to get some help, that's when they've got an issue. I applaud Wendy for coming today. She only lost her son a couple of months ago, and if anyone has children, I'm just gobsmacked that she could actually be here today. I wouldn't be able to function, so I really do applaud her being here. Thank you.
I'm not very well prepared for this, because I actually, it was a last minute invitation. But I guess what I'd like to say is I have 2 boys, Jack 19 and Antonio, who was 20, and they started playing footy ever since they were like 4 or 5 years old. They both played, apart from club footy, they played for state footy, so Norwood in South Australia. Very, very good, talented boys. And both my boys have suffered a series of concussions over the years. So I'll just start with Jack, and then I'll talk about Antonio. So it was 2016, and Jack was playing a game, and both Antonio and Jack have very different styles of football, and Jack would just go in head first all the time. Anyway, he got concussion. As he fell to the ground, his head hit a second time, and they literally walked him off the oval, which I was very surprised at. And then he just collapsed on the boundary line, and he went in and out of consciousness. It was very frightening for me. Again, I was the only one at the game because his dad was away at the time. But it was awful. Jack's eyes were rolling back in his head. You know, an ambulance came and you could hear a pin drop on the oval. And because of that concussion, Jack can't play football anymore. He had about 3 months of rehab in the brain injury unit in the Children's Hospital. They had like a support system for us. He had to go back to school, start out at 2 hours a day. And it was just awful for Jack because he had amnesia for 3 hours too that day. So he's 19 now, nearly 20, and he still has issues at remembering some things. So he was quite academic. He started a carpentry apprenticeship. That didn't sort of work out, so now he's in construction. But yeah, he originally wanted to be a geologist. So, but yeah, he's, like I said, he still has issues remembering sometimes. And there were the mood swings. I know it's very different to, you know, what you've gone through and so on, and yourselves. But yeah, it's taken about 3 years for him to get back on track from that concussion. Now we'll just move on to Antonio, which everyone's probably itching to find out about how I'm feeling about that. But so I was there. I'm not going to go into the detail of the accident in this forum, but I will give you some insight. So it was a really aggressive game that day. And usually I'm not one of those embarrassing parents that stand up on the sidelines and yells out, but this particular day I did. I found the game very thuggery. It was full of injuries, sling tackles, illegal play. There was just a lot of aggression going on. And it was the third quarter that Antonio, you know, obviously was going in. So on the day, there was the accident, and I could see it from this angle, and so it just looked like a bunch of players going in for the ball. And after seeing the footage, it was actually filmed from the other angle. I could actually see what happened, and so there was Antonio and 2 opposition players each side of him, and it really did just look like a normal play of football. And his head appears to have hit the guy's hip. And so the provisional cause of death of Antonio is head injury. It's still being investigated with the coroner. But I know he had a concussion 3 weeks prior in the trial game. I don't think that was reported because I didn't know about it being reported. And then last year he played for a different team. So this accident happened in round 1. Last year, in his last game leading up to the finals, it was actually on his birthday, August the 13th, he was playing for Waikerie, a country club, and he got concussed in the first quarter. They took him off in the second quarter, and then they let him play in the third and fourth quarter. Now, I remember, unfortunately I wasn't at that game, but his dad and his girlfriend and brother were. And from what I know, he just wanted to come home and go to bed. And he did. He used to have a series of really bad headaches, and he used to explain it in the fact that he just felt his head would explode some days, and he'd just be in bed for days. So my concern is I know, the clubs are trying to do improvements, but we really need to somehow see the reports on concussions. So I would ideally, it would be my wish to see how many, I'd like to see the documentation of the reports that were given to SANFL, the South Australian National Football League, because I don't recall any reporting done. And I know when Jack had his severe concussion, I knew the club reported it, but when I rang SANFL, it took a few weeks. I pretty much got lip service back saying it was reported, and then I asked to see the documentation, and no one could tell me anything. They just said, "Oh, we've complied, but where's the evidence?" So that's all I'm prepared to talk about the incident today. Otherwise, I'll end up in tears. But yeah, thank you.
Probably one of the most compelling reasons why we need a concussion passport. I mean, it just beggars belief is that, how, we have to have somebody die on the pitch to see that is a necessary, process that we should have. Next we've got Al Stoneham. Al was originally a player with Bulldogs. He was given number 3. He was going to be the next Teddy Whitten. I think the only resemblance is they've both probably got blonde hair. Al then moved to the Bombers, which was a stroke of genius, without my aid.
Correct.
Correct, yeah. And the rest is history. Al suffered a number of bad knocks to the head, and unfortunately he now has a disease called hydrocephalitis, which is water on the brain, and the only cure for that is to have his brain drilled and drained, and which the only way you get that is from head trauma, from a blunt force trauma.
Correct.
So it's football. I mean, he's never boxed. He's not been in any major car crashes, not fallen off his scooter, fallen off...
None of those things.
None of the above?
No. Unfortunate act at Princes Park. I had a couple of head knocks, one in particular at Princes Park in '83. I had the unfortunate opportunity to run into Dipper's forearm and knocked me out, and that was just on the bell at half-time. And I couldn't remember much about the incident other than walking off, being carried into the rooms and stood up, or Sheets, in those days, he was pretty upset about what happened, and stood me up in front of the players and suggested to them that they should be pretty unhappy about what happened to me, and that we, in the second half, take efforts to turn the tide. But part of the efforts to turn the tide was to walk me straight back out on the ground and continue to play. Look, I don't have any malice towards the football club or Sheets, because that's what you did in those days. We had no choice, but it was probably one of the most stupid things I've ever done in my life. In the ensuing weeks, I had run an office in the city. I was losing sight in my eye. I remember jumping on a tram, and in those days you had coins and paid. For the life of me, I couldn't distinguish a 20-cent piece or a 50-cent piece or anything else in my hand, because I was losing vision. And up until probably 12 months ago, I found out that was known as an optical migraine, which is caused by a blow to the head and you lose your sight. Pretty dangerous if you're driving. It has occurred while I was about to drive,
and had to sit it out and wait 20 or 30 minutes until it passed. They occur probably 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more, which is pretty scary. And at the moment, I've had my brain drained on one occasion and a minor part again, and waiting on a call from St Vincent's Hospital. They've decided that they'll put a stent in to drain the fluid from my brain because of the blood. Not looking forward to it because it's, as the doctor said, it's a minor operation, but I suggested to him that it was minor because I was having it. And he tended to agree. So I'm still waiting on a phone call. I've filled out all the paperwork and so forth, so it could happen in the next, I think they're looking at early August, so we'll just wait and see. I'd like it to happen sooner than later because my balance is lousy, my memory is awful. You just find that you're irrational. My wife is not happy. I don't know how she puts up with me, seriously. We've been together for a long time, well before I played footy, and I started in 72. But the things that she puts up with, I don't think I could. So I think I'm fairly lucky in that respect. So. But fingers crossed, I hope the operation works and the stent does its job for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. And the next leading question you ask after that, is the AFL funding your operation?
No.
Is the AFLPA? No. I mean, and that's the tragedy of this. I mean, if it was one, case, you'd think, oh, well, but it's not. It is a series of cases where these guys are left to their own, devices. Now we've got time for you, Greg, and then we're no? Okay. No. All right. Well, now we're going to have a break for lunch. There's some fantastic gourmet sandwiches there. Johnny, is that right? It's gourmet. So we'll throw them out on the tables and...
Well, just let me finish off.
Oh, sorry, Prez, yes.
Sorry, Peter. Just before we go, thank you. And on behalf of all of us here, we'd like to thank you for the contribution you've made. We know the personal issues that you've been confronting. Rocky and I know each other well. He was the runner down at the Saints for a couple of years of great fun, Alan. Thank you. So I'd like to thank them. I just reflect many years ago, we played the Hawthorn Football Club at St Kilda at the MCG. And a player, 23 for the Hawks, managed to latch on to D. Frawley. And Spud, they sent the stretcher out, and he got on it and then he got off it. And I said to Spud after the game, Spud, we sent it out for good medical reasons. Why did you find it necessarily to get off the stretcher? And his view from bravado in those days was, I will never be taken off the ground on a stretcher, I will always walk off. And we all know the circumstances of Spud's brave and courageous career. But I think in retrospect, we're all now looking at the changes of mental health and the cases of concussion. And perhaps I'll leave it for the summary, but this is a time where this sport AFL needs advocates for looking at another point of view and remembering these stories. Young Venables, who his dad we spoke to, Peter, a few minutes ago, it's an interesting synopsis, is that he went into the AFL. I had dinner with Peter and Peter. And the staff of the AFL, who are all here to help and give you good courage, and we're here to look after you, said to young Daniel Venables, we're here to look after you, we'll give you care. 12 months later, he's never received a phone call. Take this on board as one of the issues of why there's a degree of hardness and cynicism on the other side, because medical science tells us there is another story to tell. And perhaps I shouldn't delay this, but what we do need is advocates. We need people that are going to advocate and say, we hear the stories, we have seen the statistics, we now need to help our comrades, our brothers, and those that have played this great game. Enjoy your lunch, back soon, and thanks for your attendance.
So the rest of the slides on your laptop?
Yep.